Thank you very much, Sean, and good evening, everyone. First of all, I want to thank Joe and the team for inviting me here to contribute to this debate on managing the economy and public finances after the Troika, and I will try to stick to the topic as best I can. I would like to focus my remarks on a few topics. Firstly, the immediate issue of Budget 2014. What post-budget interaction with the Troika will look like, as well as offering some thoughts on the economic and public finance issues we will face once we exit the programme at the end of this year. While the forthcoming budget will be prepared under the shadow of the Troika, it relates to the calendar year starting on the 1st of January 2014, when we expect that Ireland will have successfully exited the current programme. So I believe it is appropriate to speak about it as part of this debate. Over the past 5 years or so, the Irish people have displayed a remarkable degree of forbearance in the face of a seemingly unending series of demands on their income and indeed their economic well-being. The social upheaval and the disruption associated with widespread strikes and protests witnessed in other countries have been largely avoided here in Ireland. This has to be acknowledged, but certainly not taken for granted as we frame the forthcoming budget. I think it is worth bearing in mind that the budget on October the 15th this year will actually be the 8th round of austerity measures since the first adjustments were made back in July of 2008. Since then, extremely difficult decisions were taken and implemented, and we have had success in bringing down the deficit, as the previous speakers have alluded to. While the work of the current government in reducing the deficit has to be recognised, it also has to be pointed out that 3/4 of the fiscal adjustment achieved so far is as a result of budgets introduced by the late Brian Lenihan as Minister for Finance in the previous government. In fact, were it not for the decisions that Brian initiated between July 2008 and December 2010, our primary deficit this year would actually be in the region of 20%, instead of a projected 2.5%. In that scenario, our public finances would simply have been completely out of control and our economy would literally have fallen off a cliff. This mammoth fiscal correction has, of course, come at a very heavy price indeed for the Irish people. They are weary and they want to know when all of this is going to come to an end. All of the main parties, including Fianna Fáil, are committed to bringing our deficit down to not greater than 3% by the end of 2015. The question currently taking up a lot of time on the airwaves is what the appropriate adjustment for 2014 is. Principally due to the restructuring of the promissory notes, which was achieved earlier this year, there is now some limited scope to moderate the correction of the public finances, perhaps by up to €1 billion over the next 2-year period. But this debate has to be put in context. It is not a debate about austerity on the one hand or no austerity on the other hand. It is a debate about the degree of austerity over the next 2 years at a minimum. Even those political parties in Ireland that proclaim themselves to be against austerity are really just advocating another form of austerity, be it in the form of a wealth tax or a marginal tax rate of 59% for PAYE workers, which some promote. In reality, as a country, we can only say that austerity is truly over when the Minister for Finance of the day is able to stand up on budget day and announce a neutral budget, where the net total of taxation and expenditure measures is zero. And the reality is that that scenario is still some distance away for this country. I have to say I strongly disagree with one of the suggestions of former IMF Mission Chief to Ireland, Ashoka Modi. The idea that Ireland should consider abandoning fiscal consolidation or austerity, call it what you like, altogether for the next 3 years is simply not a credible proposition. With official funding from the Troika With official funding from the Troika now almost fully drawn down, if we were to revoke our commitment to reduce the deficit, I ask the question, how willing would the international markets be to lend money to Ireland at reasonable interest rates? Not very willing at all, I believe. In that scenario, I suspect we would find ourselves back where none of us want to go, into another bailout programme very quickly indeed. There is no getting away from the reality that Ireland's deficit remains excessive, and further cuts in spending and tax increases are going to be necessary over the next 2 years. Whatever way you look at it, Ireland has to implement further cuts and tax increases of somewhere between €4 and €5 billion over the next 2 years. The ongoing debate about the precise scale of the adjustment in October's budget is really around the margins of that stark reality. But having said that, I want to turn to the question of what we should do in October's budget. The Memorandum of Understanding with the Troika does not specify a nominal adjustment for 2014. However, the decision of the European Finance Ministers ECOFIN on the 7th of December 2010, ratifying the Troika programme which had just been agreed, requires Ireland, under the excessive deficit procedure, to achieve a deficit not exceeding 5.1% in 2014 and not exceeding 2.9% in 2015. So Ireland's October's budget must ensure that Ireland's general government deficit in 2014 does not exceed 5.1% of GDP. That is the bottom line. And taking that as a given, as far as I am concerned, the Troika cannot dictate the scale of the adjustment in this October's budget. I believe that Ireland has demonstrated sufficient good faith in getting our public finances on the right track over the last 5 years to be allowed to decide for ourselves how we achieve the required deficit targets in 2014. It is true that we cannot be certain at this stage of the exact quantum of adjustment required to stay within the deficit limit next year. As an opposition party, all that we have to go on is the Stability Programme update submitted by Government to the European Commission in April of this year. This document tells us that an adjustment of €3.1 billion in October's budget will yield a deficit figure of 4.3% in 2014, well below the limit of 5.1%. I accept that the 5.1% deficit limit is non-negotiable. However, my question for the Troika is, what would be wrong with Ireland coming in with a deficit figure next year of 4.7, 4.8 or 4.9%? I accept that we have a lot of moving parts, principally emerging data on economic growth, which is very volatile indeed, and that it is not possible to be definitive until September or early October about the adjustment that is required. But having said that, at this remove, I believe we should be aiming for a deficit a little south of 5%, which would probably involve an adjustment in 2014 closer to €2.5 billion than the €3.1 billion that is currently earmarked. A number of very significant voices have been raised in favour of sticking to a €3.1 billion adjustment next year, including Klaus Regling of the ESM, Craig Beaumont of the IMF, the Fiscal Advisory Council and our own central bank. Their opinions are important and should be listened to carefully. They cite the downside risks to growth in particular as the reason for sticking to the current adjustment plan. And there are undoubted risks to our economic recovery, and many of them are indeed outside of Ireland's control. However, we do need to bear in mind just how weak the real economy is in Ireland at this point in time. In the first quarter of this year, for example, the consumption element of GDP, activity on the high street, declined by 3% on a seasonally adjusted basis. That was the fastest rate of decline since 2009. GDP has now contracted for 3 quarters in succession. Economists now expect that retail sales will fall by almost 1% in the current year, and budgetary policy absolutely has a key role to play in shaping consumer sentiment and on the distribution of disposable income. It would appear that we can no longer rely on booming exports to bolster the economy. Given the very challenging international trading environment, the outlook for the current year is not particularly encouraging on the export front. In many respects, the debate about the budget adjustment is about spending cuts. And any debate about spending cuts in Ireland is a debate about social welfare. The room to manoeuvre on the public sector pay and pensions bill is extremely limited following the Haddington Road agreement and the further sacrifices that have been made by public servants. And while you can trim around the edges of departmental spending, the reality is that social welfare is the key area a government may decide to target for substantial savings. As someone who grew up in a family that was completely dependent on social welfare income from when I was about the age of 8 onwards due to my late father's ill health, I have experienced at first hand the vital importance of basic state support for people who fall on hard times for one reason or another. Through very careful management of modest invalidity pension income, my parents were able to raise a family of 5 and put a number of us through third-level education. So I think we need to be very, very careful indeed as to where the axe falls in the social welfare budget. As I see it, the provision of weekly social welfare support should be regarded as a social contract between the state and the citizen, with obligations on both sides. The state is there to provide an essential safety net for people who are not capable of working and for those who are genuinely unable to find work. The corresponding obligation is that those who have the capacity to work are required to actively seek it and to engage meaningfully in the various activation initiatives offered by the state. The key to social welfare reform, in my opinion, and to achieving savings in the area, lies in the whole area of labour activation and in making work pay, and not in cutting around the edges of the benefits given to the most vulnerable people in the country, carers, disabled, elderly, and indeed supports for children. The social welfare system has to be reformed in 2 fundamental ways, in my opinion. Firstly, it should always pay to go to work. The truth is now, when you take into account the secondary benefits that exist, it does not always pay many people to remove themselves from the welfare net for the type of money that they would be likely to earn in the workforce. The second key welfare reform that is needed is to put some safety net in place for self-employed people who fall on hard times. It is completely unfair, in my opinion, that a person in business paying into the PRSI system perhaps for many decades, and employing people in the local economy, has no automatic entitlement to benefits whatsoever when their business gets into difficulty. So what will happen at the end of the current Troika programme, and what does it mean? As we prepare to exit the programme, the public will rightly ask, how will life be different in Ireland in the years ahead? When I put the question to the Troika during our various meetings as to what their involvement would be in Ireland in the future, their answer was pretty simple. We will still make regular visits, our profile will be lower, we will just be a little less annoying, but we will still be there. Quarterly Troika visits will be replaced by half-yearly Troika visits. We will still have to reach our medium-term objective of a structural deficit of not greater than 0.5%, as Tony has said. Essentially, the aim will be for balanced budgets over the economic cycle. The departure of the Troika next December will undoubtedly be a success for this government and indeed for the country. But we would do well not to exaggerate its practical impact on our people. Given the development of strict European fiscal and debt rules, which have already been referred to, the reality is that economic sovereignty is a very qualified principle at this stage. Even if these rules did not apply, are we really suggesting that the international money markets would demand any less fiscal discipline from us as a country? I certainly think not. A constant criticism of public policy in Ireland, and it's one that I would share, is the belief that policy is formulated on the basis of short-term needs and takes little or no account of the longer-term implications of decisions taken. And as we move towards exiting the bailout programme, we could do with taking a hard look at how long-term policy formulation is undertaken. The days of aligning economic and budgetary policy with the electoral cycle has to be put firmly behind us. A proper structure must be put in place that requires governments to devise policies that base our public finances and economic performance on an economic model that is sustainable over the longer term. The establishment of the Fiscal Advisory Council has been a very positive step in the right direction. And while much of the debate centres on the public finances, the truth is that a reinvigorated economy will solve our unemployment crisis and correct our public finances. We're still doing quite well on inward investment. Ireland remains an attractive location to invest. As the only English-speaking country in the Eurozone, with a stable political system and a well-educated workforce, we have great strength. Our corporation tax regime is attractive, and we have consistently rated high among countries as a good place to do business. I genuinely believe that the whole area of small and medium-sized enterprises does not get the attention that it deserves in this country. Employing in the region of 700,000 people, SMEs are the real engine of the Irish economy, and some key issues need to be addressed to help them along their way. Our cost base is actually still too high, in my opinion. For example, the cost of gas, electricity and waste disposal are critical issues for businesses. The burden of local authority rates is crippling small business. This area is crying out for radical reform. Too many businesses are still locked into Celtic Tiger-type rents that are completely inappropriate for the economy of 2013. The amount of red tape and compliance facing SMEs needs to be seriously examined. The banks need to start finally lending to the economy in the way that was envisaged when they were recapitalised. The tens of thousands of families who cannot play an active role in our economic recovery because of the overhang of mortgage arrears and personal debt need sustainable solutions for once and for all. The thriving black economy has to be tackled with imaginative initiatives such as rewarding households that use registered, tax-compliant contractors for home improvement work. There is an absolute need to balance fiscal consolidation with investment in the economy, and we are not getting that balance right, in my opinion. The Strategic Investment Fund, with the potential to invest about €6 billion in the economy, has to be fast-tracked. The remaining sheltered sectors of the economy, including many of the commercial state companies, in my opinion, need to experience the cold winds of competition. These are not new issues, but they need to be tackled with renewed gusto in the post-Troika Ireland. In conclusion, Chairperson, to a large extent, the Troika have been a convenient whipping boy for government, opposition and interest groups alike. Many reforms which we knew deep down needed to be carried out could at least be safely initiated in the knowledge that we could claim it was being forced upon us by our friends in the Troika. Their departure will not relieve us of the need to continue the process of fiscal adjustment and economic reform. The lasting legacy of the programme should be a commitment across all political parties to stable public finances and to foster policy formulation based on long-term economic and social needs of the country. Over the next few years, we will find out whether Ireland, and indeed Europe, and that is an altogether different but related debate, has truly learned the lessons from the most turbulent economic period in over half a century. I sincerely hope we have. Thank you all very much for listening.